Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us for today's panel on the wage gap and our shared work towards economic justice for AANHPI women. My name is Christina Baal Owens, and I'm the proud executive director of the National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum, better known as NAPAWF. Just a few days ago, on April 9th, we marked AANHPI Equal Pay Day, a moment to highlight the persistent pay disparities that exist among many ethnic groups that make up AANHPIs. Too often, these differences are hidden in aggregated data. When differences in pay are hidden in broad averages, they are also more likely to be overlooked in decision-making, leading to underinvestment in disaggregated data, research, and targeted policy solutions. These gaps also challenge the model minority myth, which falsely portrays A and HPI communities as uniformly successful. In reality, with more than 50 distinct ethnic groups, there's no single AA and HPI experience. Overall, AA and HPI women are paid about 83 cents for every dollar paid to non-Hispanic white men. But when the data is broken down even further, we see that some populations, such as Afghan, Bangladeshi, and Burmese women, experience much larger pay gaps. These disparities are shaped by interesting factors: race, gender, ethnicity, immigration status, language access, disability, and caregiving responsibilities. Immigrant women, for example, are often pushed into low wage or informal work with fewer protections. Caregiving responsibilities, especially within A and HPI households, often fall on women, affecting their earnings and career paths. Education alone does not close the gap. At every level of education, AA and HPI women earn less than white men with the same level of educational attainment, underscoring the impact of workplace discrimination, occupational segregation, and unequal access to leadership opportunities. These overlapping challenges make clear that closing the wage gap requires more than a single solution, and the urgency is only growing. In our latest report, Beyond the Labels, AAPI women and gender expansive people consistently express deep concern over rising costs of living. Today's conversation focuses on how we move from documenting disparities to building power and policy solutions, bringing together the voices of worker organizations, national gender justice advocates, and congressional leadership to close the gap. So before I introduce our panelists, I wanted to note that if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A box. For those of you joining us on YouTube, you can drop your questions in the comments. So I'd love to introduce our amazing speakers that are joining us today. Fatima Gosgrave, CEO of the National Women's Law Center. She is a close partner of NAPAWF and a nationally recognized leader in the fight for gender justice and an expert in law, policy, and cultural change. Fatima has a distinguished track record working across a broad set of issues central to the lives of women and girls, including income security and COVID relief, equal pay, ending sexual harassment and violence, health and reproductive rights, education access, and workplace justice, with a particular focus on outcomes for women and girls of color. Sandra Engel is the executive director of the Asian Pacific American Labor Alliance, also known as APALA. A longtime labor leader and organizer, she began her career as a public defender with the Legal Aid Society of New York and was elected vice president of UAW Local 2325. She went on to organize with unions across the country and later served in multiple leadership roles within the UAW, most recently as a top advisor to the UAW president, leading public relations and strategic campaigns. Sandra brings a deep commitment to worker power and advocacy, grounded in her belief that organizing equips people to fight for themselves and their communities. So to ground us in the lived experience of workers, I'm going to start with you, Sandra. What does real accountability look like to AA and HPI women experiencing wage inequity right now?
Am I unmuted now?
Yep. Yes, you are.
Okay, sorry about that.
No
Sorry
worries.
about that, participants. Yeah, so thank you, Christina Napa, for organizing this event on such an important issue. When I think about the lived experience of ANHPI women workers, I think you have to start with what it means to work in 2026. There are so many new challenges facing anyone trying to support themselves in 2026, from things like a stagnant federal minimum wage, attacks on the National Labor Relations Board, affordable housing, access to healthcare, job insecurity across multiple sectors and industries, and new threats posed by AI to the labor market, which is something that this generation of workers is facing that previous generations did not have to. And this is really just the start of the story. These are just pressures that I think all workers are facing today. But when you add the overlay of what it is to be an AANHPI woman worker in the workforce, the stress points I think grow. You flagged some of them that I think are really important for us to really consider. One of them is language access, which is often a challenge. Language access can be a real impediment at the work site, especially it isolates you from really understanding your rights. It isolates you often from like promotion within an industry or a sector. And so language access is and language barriers are definitely something that are faced by many ANHPI workers. And in fact, I think I looked at the statistics. 65% of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders today are foreign born. That makes us a super majority immigrant. And so it's something that we have to consider that I think other communities are not faced with that challenge. Um, we as ANHPI women often end up working in low wage occupations or in sectors that are very not well regulated. A good example of this is domestic workers. These are housekeepers, nannies, home care aides. Over 90% of women, of the workers within the domestic worker industry are women, and over half of those are women of color. So these workers are 3 times as likely to be living in poverty. They often work in isolation, are not even aware of the basic employment rights, as few as those are. So in addition to these disparities, I think wage disparities and the statistics you raised exist, but I think we also need to think about wage disparities in other ways too, because ANHPI women are often more vulnerable to wage theft. That's the illegal withholding of earned wages or benefits by employers. They're a vulnerable population very often. And a study of the New York nail salon workers, for example, found that 80% of those workers experienced some form of wage theft. Sorry, 80%. I mean, just want you to imagine 80% of your coworkers being ripped off by the boss. And by the way, of those nail salon workers in New York, 73% of them identify as AA and HPI. So it's a staggering representation of, I think, what it's like to be an ANHPI woman worker and be vulnerable to all these pressures. So although today's focus, I think, is going to focus on the wage disparity for our community, I think there are other work-related issues that are very much partnered with the wage gap and wage disparities that are also masked, I think, by the failure to disaggregate the data. And we can't forget them because they all contribute to the quality of work. And those are things like workplace safety, benefits such as healthcare, retirement, even a modicum of job security. All of these also lag for our community and women, especially of certain ethnicities. And I think the failure to disaggregate the data also disguises that pain point for a lot of people who are really just trying to survive and support their families. The bottom line is that too many ANHPI women workers are falling behind. And one of the first steps in addressing this is telling their stories through the data, and the story that has for too often been masked by the failure to disaggregate the data. And I think you pointing out the connection with the model minority myth, that's a pernicious combination. You put those two things together and we become practically invisible. So I really want to appreciate you raising this issue, and I really look forward to hearing more from the other panelists.
Thank you so much, Sandra. We'll definitely be coming back to you because I think there's a lot of work that our movement should be doing alongside labor. But I do want to recognize that we're joined right now by Congresswoman Grace Meng. Congresswoman Grace Meng is a longtime fighter for ANHPI women, a long-term time colleague. I'm so happy to have known her since she was Assemblywoman Grace Meng in the New York State Assembly, and she has spent her career fighting for our community. She's a trailblazing member of Congress, proudly representing New York's 6th District. And as the first and only Asian American member of Congress from New York State, she's been a powerful advocate for communities of color, families, small businesses, and women. A senior member of the House Appropriations Committee and the chair of the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus, also known as CAPAC, Congresswoman Meng has championed legislation to combat anti-Asian hate, close gender pay gaps, and expand access to resources for immigrant and working class families. So thank you so much for joining us today, Congresswoman Meng. Building on what Sandra shared, what does it mean for Congress to be accountable to workers on the ground?
First of all, thank you so much, Christina, for having me today. And thank you, as always, to Fatima and Sandra for their knowledge, their compassionate leadership in fighting for our shared communities. Every time I am on or with the Napoff family and extended family, I feel like I'm always invited as like a guest speaker, but I always receive so much more than I give when I'm with all of you. And it's because we get to cherish our shared experiences and help to advocate for those who may not be able to speak up on these issues that affect so many. Invisible is the right word to use. It's an honor to join you all again as we're commemorating AANHPI Women's Equal Pay Day. Being accountable to workers means putting their dignity, safety, and financial security at the center of our economic policies. It means that ensuring people can earn a livable wage and build a good life for themselves and their families. And it means creating an economy that really works for everyone, not just those at the topmost leadership levels. Congress should be focused on policies that make these goals a reality. But unfortunately, many of my colleagues across the aisle are acquiescing to what this president wants rather than working on and passing legislation that supports our workers within our community and beyond and help to build an economy that works for everyone. Many have stayed silent as the administration enacted unconstitutional tariffs that drove up costs and are stretching people's salaries, attacking workers' rights, and waging foreign wars instead of addressing the urgent needs of the American people. Half of AAPI adults say that the cost of living, including groceries, housing, and their wages, are major sources of stress in their lives now, and the things that they want Congress to focus on. Being accountable to workers means Congress must find ways to deliver relief to working families across the country. One area that our caucus, KPAC, is working on is to be more accountable to our community is for the millions of AANHPI women who are domestic workers. These jobs, which include home health aides, nannies, cleaners, and live-in caretakers, are often filled by women from our community who are also trying to care for maybe their aging parents and growing kids in their own families. And that's why we support legislation like the Domestic Workers Bill of Rights Act, which would extend workplace rights to over 2 million domestic workers across the country who are excluded from many of the protections guaranteed to other workers under federal law. We must also continue to push for policies that support workers, including raising the minimum wage, combating inflation, and taking on these large, big corporations that are price gouging working people. These are the priorities that the American people are demanding that Congress address, and it's our duty to be responsive to the people that we were elected to serve.
Thank you so much for that, Congresswoman. I also, it makes me think about how specifically AA and HPI women are, when we talk about affordability at NAPOF, we really like to include the idea that healthcare and caretaking, childcare and elder care, that the price of those things really affects our ability to live and to make our wages be living wages. And also, really we are on a mission to really expand the definition of affordability to include those things. And A and HPI women are both represented as people living in intergenerational households looking for childcare and elder care, and also overrepresented in those caretaking positions. So you've brought up some really great points for us, and the work ahead alongside you and other members of Congress is will be long, and there's a lot of it, as Sandra has said, but excited to be working with you. On that note, I'd love to zoom out a little bit to look at the broader infrastructure needed to close the gap nationally. And Fatima, you have been really instrumental in creating both, working, leading NWLC, but also the National Partnership. I mean, sorry, it was also the 75 Million Women campaign. Can you share a little bit about the aims of that campaign and how your organization and campaigns like 75 Million can meaningfully partner with worker justice organizations to build better support and amplify AANHPI-led organizing?
Thanks so much, Christina. And it was so great to hear from you as well, Congresswoman. I'm excited to talk to you all about the 75 Million campaign. The 75 Million is a coalition of 10 leading organizations that work to advance gender justice and economic equity for all women. And we are so glad that NAPAF has been such an instrumental partner in this campaign. The name 75 million reflects the 75 million women who make up America's workforce and really whose rights and whose dignity and whose futures have been on the line and under threat in recent years in particular. And although women make up about half of the workforce, if you think about the work that they do, they in so many ways are the backbone of American families. You heard earlier about women's representation as domestic workers. Make up critical infrastructure in healthcare, critical infrastructure in as educators in so many roles, even if you only focused on the roles women play in fields where that have been traditionally and historically held by women, they have been making up the backbone of our families and our industries. But we're in a really tough time now where under this administration, we have been seeing decades of progress being rolled back and reversed at the expense of women and at the expense of their family. And these rollbacks are not accidental. We didn't just trip into this place. We are actually in a situation where our civil rights protections are being stripped from the workplace and where we're really losing freedoms. And so the goal of this campaign and the work that we are doing is to find a way for all of us together to increase public awareness, to align and as a block hold policymakers accountable, and to support working women's voices and to lift up their experiences. And so I'm so glad that we are doing this work in partnership with all of you. It feels both exciting and almost radical to be at a time of such deep backlash and such entrenched efforts to undermine the success of women to actually hold hands together and demand far more. And so that's what we are doing with this campaign and grateful to be doing it with all of you.
Along those lines, Sandra, the labor movement has historically been really amazing at cross movement, organizing, and collaboration. So, from your perspective, what are some of the most meaningful ways that we can strengthen AA and HPI worker-led power through collaboration?
Um, yeah, I think let me first say when I was listening to you, Fatima, I was reminded that every day I wake up alternately terrified and excited. Because there's something about this moment that is truly galvanizing. It's really bottom lining everything for all of us. Like it is, pick a side. There's no in between anymore. And so I am pained that so many people are paying the price of this, from their lives to their economic insecurity to being displaced, all those things. But I'm also excited that this moment is challenging us to really just sort of dig deep into who we are, who do we want to be, and what are you going to put into the fight to make it happen. So thank you for putting that in context. In terms of how to answer your question, Christina, my answer is probably going to be really straightforward, and that is organizing. Whether it's community groups or worker centers or labor unions, I believe that at the end of the day, there communities, our allies, our friends, and through that, we will be able to push back against the very deep pocketed, very people in power who don't have our interests at heart. It's really the only way. We're never going to be able to outspend them. We're never going to be able to do all the control all the levers of institutions that they control, but we do have people power. I'll talk specifically about labor unions as an antidote to especially the wage gap, because labor unions are a very powerful antidote to this. So on average, union workers earn about 11.2% more than their non-union counterparts, and that's a significant union difference. And this has been consistent over decades. This also doesn't take into account that union members usually typically have much better access to employer-sponsored health care, retirement benefits, job security, health safety on the job, all the sort of elements that feed into, I think, what is a job that you can raise your family on. But because unionizing is such an equalizing factor, many employers will fight it tooth and nail to stop workers from organizing. And that's why having important laws, or actually just maintaining the laws we have is really critical, because nothing would please, employers more than to really strip workers of the right to collectively organize and go back to an economy where people are told that they should just be grateful for the work that they have and just sort of, suffer the conditions, because that's just the cost of like just working for someone. We've evolved so far from that. We've gained so many rights, but as Fatima pointed out, as the Congresswoman pointed out, they are being eroded day by day. And we're in a space now where we're not really talking affirmatively about the vision of what we have for the future. We're just trying to sort of hold back the burning fires that are all around us. For unions, though, I think this means, if we're going to talk about organizing as a solution, is that the labor movement really needs to organize in places where AA and HPI women work, where there is density. And that's a challenge that we're taking on in Apala and talking to our union partners about that. Very often a union campaign starts with a lead. It starts with interest to form a union, right? And so I think that's important in talking to community members, to sort of introduce the idea that organizing is an option. Are there workers willing to sort of step up and share their stories, tell us what's going on, so we can work to get with them to sort of help them form their unions. So I think listening to those stories and then also connecting them with unions is very important. In the labor world, we use two big tools to advance economic security, and that's obviously collective bargaining, but also policy. We're very deeply committed to the idea that we need to advocate for ourselves among the electeds, and you can't uncouple them. Walter Reuther, UAW president, famously said that there's a direct relationship between the ballot box and the bread box, and what the union fights for and wins at the bargaining table can be taken away at the legislative halls. And so this twin mission of both, negotiating with the boss at the table and holding those contracts intact, but also ensuring that policymakers are making decisions that don't erode what we're winning at the bargaining table, that help lift up all workers, right? Because we're committed to organizing all workers and lifting up all workers. That's an important element of the labor movement as well. But I have to mention that there are other models of organizing. Worker centers are very effective within immigrant communities. They do powerful work. They're often organizing workers who don't qualify for organizing, sometimes very unfairly, because they're misclassified, but not every worker can organize under the Railway Act or the National Labor Relations Act. And so worker centers are a very powerful way to sort of ensure some kind of fairness and advocacy for them. And so I really encourage people in their communities to get to know the worker centers, support the work that they're doing. It's often very difficult work, but they're really in the trenches, working directly with a lot of the workers that we're talking about.
Thanks, Sandra. As someone who came up through the labor movement, I'm coming into this position at NAPHOF really excited to be collaborating more with labor. And I think there's a lot of work we can be doing together to support AANHPI women and all workers, and to really be working together to strategically close this pay gap. Congresswoman Meng, you had brought up some pieces of legislation that you believe and are supporting to work on closing the gap, this wage gap that we're discussing today. But as someone working at the federal level, how can platforms like yours help elevate AA and HPI workers' stories to shape policy and advocacy priorities?
Thank you for the question. And we have had to be even more creative with how we are collecting and sharing those stories. Right now, under this administration, I don't have to tell you all here, there have been very intentional efforts straight from the very institutions that our community are part of that are trying to silence our community. And when we talk about from the top down and corporate greed, sometimes that kind of exists in our own communities too, right? Like a lot of the stories that we want our the women in our community to share. I will be honest, as a lawmaker and as a public servant, we have to try to use a little bit extra TLC sometimes with, let's say, someone who is first generation or someone who is like the small business owner or the one who is hiring a lot of these women. And we've had to not only collect these stories, but find ways to work with the first generation or the bosses, let's say, and also like ethnic media outlets, which are trusted sources for so many in our community and are often very helpful and effective in sharing these stories. We need to provide a human face to issues that are important to our communities. And when Sandra mentioned earlier with the nail salons, people might not even know that these are as serious issues as they are within the communities until these women are sharing their stories. And a lot of these women are now, our communities are being harmed by the administration's changing policies. And I'll give you an example, which we all know of in Minnesota when the ICE agents were targeting Asian immigrants. KPAC and I worked with the Minnesota State AAPI caucus and local organizations on the ground to host a press conference because we wanted to make sure that their stories were being heard on how the Trump administration's cruel immigration policies are also impacting our communities. Speakers shared stories from the Hmong, Khmer, and Karen Vietnamese and South Asian residents who were literally afraid to go to work or send their kids to school because of the fear caused by this administration's immigration policies. And if we are not uplifting the stories from our community, a lot of times the policies we implement will continue to exclude the voices and experiences of Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders. As another example, when Republicans voted to pass the largest cut to Medicaid history, we partnered with healthcare advocacy organizations to collect and highlight stories on how these cuts were directly harming people from our community. We had one story of someone named Armand, a resident from California, who said that he would need to set up a preemptive GoFundMe in order to pay his medical bills because the cuts would make it impossible for him to pay for care otherwise. Last year, our community reported that the cost of healthcare is one of the affordability issues that they are most concerned about. So it's really important that we show just how impactful these policy decisions are for our communities and tell our stories about the consequences that workers and their families are going to face because of these types of cuts.
Thanks for that. I am going to make somewhat shameless plug for NAPOF is creating a Storyteller Academy. I believe this cohort, we had a lot more applications and we had spots for this, but we are working with members of our member organizations or partners to be able to train members to give testimony in front of Congress, to write op-eds, to essentially use their stories as advocacy. And a lot of this came from your, meetings with your colleagues and with you, Congresswoman Meng, talking about the importance of stories on the ground and making sure that we're centering the stories of AANHPI women. So for those of you who are watching this or attending this now, if you are interested in future cohorts of that type of training for your constituencies, happy to continue to talk about that because, as you had said, Representative Meng, these are the stories that give color and that talk about how these policies come down on the ground and how they affect people. And often, again, we're fighting against the model minority myth. We are fighting against AA and HPI women not being centered in a lot of these discussions. So NAPAWF is really committed to making sure that our stories are centered and part of these really important policy discussions. I know you have to leave us shortly, Congresswoman Meng, so I wanted to give you a little bit more space. You did talk about specific pieces of legislation that you think would be really important for us to be supporting and moving forward in the fight for economic justice for our communities. But what specific federal policy tools are most important to closing the wage gap for ANHPI women? So whether that's through pay transparency, stronger enforcement of existing legislation, or investments in care infrastructure. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, all of the above. And I do want to, related to this, I do want to give a shout out to former highest ranking officials in both the Biden and Obama Labor Department, Chris Liu and Julie Su, who, amongst everything that they had to manage, came to my district in Queens and spoke to both business owners and everyday workers in our ANHPI community to talk about, for example, OSHA rules, to talk about what it meant to really provide for your employees. And that kind of cultural competent outreach is also important as we're talking about even existing rules. And over this second term of President Trump, the federal tools that should already be in place to support our workers and close the wage gap are under attack more than ever. The president's proposed budget for fiscal year 27 includes a 26% cut to the Department of Labor. This potential budget cut will only aggravate the Doge cuts from last year, which resulted in over 1 in 5 Department of Labor employees from being fired. Additionally, the EEOC, which is, as you know, a federal agency created to enforce civil rights laws and protect workers from discrimination, has been weaponized to investigate purported discrimination against white men instead of protecting vulnerable and underserved workers in our communities. And this is really shameful. And that's why Congress must step up and exercise our oversight authority. We can't right now trust these federal agencies under this administration to do the right thing for our women and our minority communities. Our caucus has worked in tandem with the Democratic Women's Caucus to continue to apply pressure on the EEOC and to use our platform to call out the harm being done to workers. It's also why we must focus on congressional efforts to eliminate the gender wage gap and guarantee wage transparency. There are bills like the Paycheck Fairness Act, which is supported by every KPAC member. Another tool that Congress should be using to help workers is legislation like the Healthy Families Act. This would guarantee every worker in America paid sick leave. We can't truly close the wage gap without addressing the many factors that women especially have to face, especially women of color, including the need to balance work with caregiving and personal health. I'm so grateful and I look forward to working with NAPAWF and all our advocates here to advance policies to close the wage gap and ensure that everyone in our communities has an equal shot at success. Thanks for letting me join you for a little bit and so inspired as always by the work that each of you and your members do.
Thank you, Congresswoman Meng, and thank you so much for being one of our strongest voices, if not the strongest voice for our community in the halls of Congress. Um, Being that in this current climate really takes a real will of steel, so want to recognize you and thank you again for making time for us. So as we've discussed today, the barriers facing an AA and HPI women workers don't exist in isolation, and neither can the solutions, especially at a time when the economic inequities are deepening across communities. Sandra, back to you. What does meaningful cross-racial and cross-movement alignment actually look like in a practice when it comes to pay equity? And what's one step we can take to build that alignment more intentionally?
Um, yeah, well, I think a first critical step is this conversation we're having today. I feel like we have to fight doubly hard to surface this as an issue because our story is hidden, masked by the data, right? That's the whole problem with the disaggregation, the lack of disaggregation of the data. And obviously, I mentioned earlier, when you couple it with the model minority myth, we practically disappear. And the problem is that this is not just an issue for, I think, people who don't have our interest at hearts, but even our allies, when they rely on the data, they themselves can often overlook our pain and our concerns because they're relying on sort of just the raw data that's out there, which doesn't disaggregate for our communities. And they don't take the extra steps to understand that we are not a monolith. We represent just a huge spectrum of people from different nations, different religions, different languages, different cultures. And if you don't have like a sensitivity to understanding that, you're going to miss the real story. And that's what's happening. And then when you couple that with model minority, where there's just sort of a predisposition to think that our community is just not impacted or hurt by policies and that we're thriving in an era of chaos, which is both factually false, but also a real patronizing way to sort of ignore our existence and our pains and our right to sort of want to do better. I think you end up in the place that we have here. And I also, this is also playing out, I think the Congresswoman mentioned in the reporting that you're seeing around ICE, where the stories, the news media focuses very much on what they call the Black and Brown communities. That's how the story is being characterized. And although I know people in our communities do identify that, it's not really a term that describes everybody in our community. And so we internally have conversations about wanting the media to be really inclusive about who's being affected and impacted, which communities are being hurt. And so I'm very glad to see the extra effort was taken in Minnesota to really highlight what was happening to those two vulnerable communities. I think in terms of a specific thing that I would like to sort of leave behind for people on this Zoom is that when you highlighted the notion of cross-racial organizing, I think that that's such a critical thing to keep in mind because we are not going to get there just by having this conversation among AANHPI women. We have to raise this as an issue that affects all workers. We have to like be a part, we have to be at the table. Our faces, our stories have to be part of the discussions, whether it's in Congress or even in our neighborhoods, at work sites, within our unions. If we frame this as just an issue that affects us and we don't have representation in the room, it's really easy to ignore us. So pathways to leadership are really important within our community. So we have elected representatives who understand us and can advocate for us. It doesn't matter how good of an ally you are. We know that we will advocate for ourselves the best. And so without that, we truly are just sort of shut out of the conversations. And so we need to always be pushing for that. And then finally, we all belong to these communities, right? Whether our families live in communities that are rich with immigrants, or we're working in environments where we do a lot of work with the immigrant community. We have an opportunity to talk to them about meaningful ways to sort of engage and change their outlook. Because even though I firmly believe there's a policy component to this, that we need to disaggregate the data, at the end of the day, we really need to advocate and organize ourselves to sort of change the status quo. The status quo is not going to change just because the data changes. It really is going to come down to us collectively organizing and supporting one another.
I do want to point out, and Sandra, thank you for that. And my our team can fact check in the chat if this is off, but AANHPI covers about 50 ethnicities
Yeah.
that speak over 100 languages. So, organizing within our community can often be more costly, more time intensive. But again, it is important and is an investment. We're seeing that, these economic justice issues are directly affected by how much our community knows, what rights they know, and also just the ability to be getting really, correct information out by a trusted messenger. So really thankful to you for doing that within the labor movement. Fatima, just a little bit about creating campaigns that create cross-movement solidarity. How can national gender equity campaigns continue to do that and also translate cross-movement solidarity into concrete policy wins that directly improve pay equity for A and HPI women workers?
Well, I'm so glad you mentioned that, and it actually is helpful to build on something that the Congresswoman mentioned, so that we can talk really specifically. She went through the fight that's right in front of us around the budget and the range of cuts that this administration is proposing for the Department of Labor, for the EEOC, for the Department of Justice, all in service, not on putting resources in other areas of people's lives. The president has been very, very clear that he plans to cut a range of domestic programs only to pay for his war. As you heard him from the White House say, we can't afford things like daycare. What an opportunity for people to come together across a range of areas in this country, across a range of strategies that they may be using, to actually align clearly and name not just that they don't like these totally inappropriate attacks, but to dream ahead, right? And so that's one of the things that I see us doing right now through both the 75 million campaign and beyond, naming the threats that we are experiencing, whether it is the aggressive anti-DEI attacks or this specific threat that we're talking about, these cuts to the Department of Labor, these cuts to the EEOC, so that our civil rights enforcement is fully gutted, coming together across space, across type, across race, across gender, to join together to sort of say, we want and expect more. I hope that Congresswoman Ming and every member of Congress's phones are ringing off the hook about what the budget that went forward. I hope that community organizations are able to make a direct line between what it is they experience day to day and what it's like when there is no one at the EEOC to hear your charge, what it is like when there's no one at the Department of Labor to investigate the claims of wage theft, or there's no one to enforce their existing mandates. What I said in the beginning, and I just want to return to, is none of this is an accident. It's not as if the ongoing gutting of our civil rights enforcement, our ongoing gutting of protections, was an accident. It was the design. It was the plan all along to make it so that those who's are most vulnerable in the workplace have the fewest places to go.
Thank you for that. I'm just sitting here thinking about how much work there is ahead of us, but also how grateful I am to be in this work with the both of you. Such an amazing opportunity this afternoon to have this really important conversation with two of the leaders in this movement. I want to close out with a final question, both a thought and then a question. Um, I believe if we're truly aligned, and this is why NAPOF does work like this, grassroots worker leaders, congressional champions, and national gender equity organizations, if we're truly aligned, there's really so much we can be accomplishing together before the next AANHPI Equal Pay Day. So my question for both of you, and we could start with you, Fatima, is what is one concrete action, policy organizing, or research, so one action that falls into either of those categories, that you think needs to happen before AA and HPI Equal Pay Day next year?
Uh, I actually think between now and the Equal Pay Day next year, I would love to see people not only understand what the wage gap is, but to take one opportunity to tell a friend, to spread the word, to bring them in that fold. Right now, one of our biggest challenges is that we are dealing with information overload. So
Mm.
people would love to focus on the wage gap, but the moment they do, they get distracted with something else that is incredibly pressing and upending people's lives. I would love to see over the next year, people who are tuning in right now, make a list and figure out who you're going to tell about the wage gap and invite them into NAPOF, invite them into organizations like the National Women's Law Center so that they can take action with us throughout the course of the year.
That would be amazing. I also, there is something happening between this year and next year, a little midterm that maybe we'll have some better targets to be talking to on the Hill. Question over to you, Sandra. What is something that you would like to see between this year and next year?
What I can tell you is what we're working on because we really do the disaggregation issue it affects more than just a conversation around the wage gap. This disaggregation issue affects really any kind of a policy or statistics-based discussion that you need to have about any kind of ANHPI density in anything. And so one of the things, one of our mantras within Apala is that we're going to save ourselves. We're not going to wait for someone to save us. We have to save ourselves. So we're taking on projects like creating an ANHPI fact sheet to distribute to unions and union communicators to both talk about like a myriad of things, including pointing out that they need to take the effort to disaggregate the data and what that means, what that looks like. And if the data is too difficult to disaggregate, then we need to invest resources in disaggregating it. And this includes not just labor, but labor's allies like the EPI, which is sort of like our little policy research ally when it comes to economic issues. And I think the other thing that we're going to start to do more of, I've been thinking about this since you invited us to participate in this, Christina, is that we need to demystify the whole term disaggregation. I mean, it's like a lot of syllables and it sounds very wonky, but I think most people, it's we need to break down what the term means and what the harm it causes when it's not done. And so we really want to take this message down to the rank and file because I really feel if everyone's conversant on why this issue is being masked, it naturally leads, I think, hopefully to a space where we're all investing more resources and saying, well, we need to address this. And I think the problem is that we can't even get to the table to have that conversation because everyone's sort of like living in this world where this problem doesn't exist yet. And we have to just make this problem real for them. But I'm hopeful, I'm encouraged just in the space with you, just historically what we've been able to do, what's going on in terms of the zeitgeist. When I see so many people coming out to events that were never political before, there's something in the air that people are just sort of like, this is not what I want. And so there is an opportunity to sort of not only push back and reverse this, but also have the conversation about what it is that we do want. What Fatima was saying is that we need to dream about what's going to happen next. And it can't be just going back to how it was. We have an opportunity to sort of rebuild. And being involved and engaged in that conversation, I think between now and next year is going to be critical too.
Well, thank you to both of you for your time today and for your ongoing work fighting for AA and HPI workers and all workers, and to working alongside NAPOF to close this wage gap that we are identifying today and committed to fighting. You've heard quite a lot, for the participants, you've heard quite a lot about the importance of data. NAPOF is very aware that one, the disaggregated or the data that really reflects the diversity in our communities did not really exist even before this administration, or there was very little of it. And then we also know that it is being erased as we speak. So NAPOF is committed to not only doing this type of research, but also making it widely available for our partners. Sandra and Fatima, you both talked about how time and cost intensive this kind of data can be. So NAPOF is committed to making it free and accessible to our partners who are working on economic justice issues for our community. You'll see that in the chat, our team has dropped in a link to our latest fact sheet, Fact versus Fiction about the wage gap. We've also done research in partnership with In Our Own Voice and the Latina Institute on it's called the sorry, I'm looking at the thing right now. It is the Intersections of Our Lives campaign. It looks at the views that women of color have on both the economy, affordability, also things like reproductive justice, and that is available both in the chat and on our website. So thank you to you both again, and thank you to everyone who joined us today. Please feel free to reach out to the team at NAPOF if there's anything we can be doing to support the work you're all doing out in the field too. So thanks again. Take care.